You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. Today I'm pleased to return with the third mythos story by the contemporary British writer Tamlan Dipper. In the Whispering Deep, which takes place during the height of the Second World War, concerns the Women's Royal Navy Service, the Wrens, and their efforts to crack a mysterious code referred to as Silent Strutter. After listening, be sure to see the video description to read the author's accompanying endnotes. Chapter times and a link to the Tamlan Dipper playlist can also be found in the description. I hope you enjoy this one. The Whispering Deep by Tamlan Dipper. I worked at Bletchley. I've never told anyone that before. I don't suppose I'll get in trouble, but we were told we couldn't talk about it, even after the war. I noticed you were reading that book, and I felt you would understand. Anonymous Lady to the author, on a bus, 2007. This story is dedicated to all the Debs of Bletchley and the Women's Royal Navy Service for their contributions to the defeat of fascism. This is not their story, but it is intended as a respectful homage to their skill and determination. Taynton, Oxfordshire, August 1942. Golden yellow sunlight rolled into the dark hallway like a spoonful of honey onto a dead tongue. A grandfather clock stood in dignified silence, its mechanism run down. Then there was a rattle of keys, and the door banged open. "Over there, Corporal. Just put the things in the drawing room, and we can unpack later," said a clear voice, a woman's voice, but accustomed to command. A lanky teenager in khaki battle dress staggered in, followed by a much shorter soldier, grinning with exertion under wooden boxes. They navigated with difficulty into the adjoining room, and there were sounds of narrowly averted catastrophe, which the woman discreetly overlooked. "That's right, just pop it there for now. Stow the rest of the crates any way you can out of the weather, then cut along and see to your own bunks." Two more women joined her in the doorway, looking apprehensively inside. All three were dressed in the neat dark blue uniforms of the Women's Royal Navy Service, the Wrens. "It's a bit cold, isn't it?" said the tall, thin woman, standing aside to let the soldiers pass back out. "I'll scout round for some firewood. I wonder if they left an axe," the shorter blonde stated. "Is there a fireplace?" She took two more tentative steps and peered around. "Oh, marvelous. Just look in here. We shall be very cozy." The taller woman looked askance as the commanding woman stepped back outside. "Where will the men sleep, do you think?" she inquired coldly. "Oh, I don't know," said the blonde, checking the boxes with abstraction. "I expect they'll sleep in the outbuildings. They're soldiers, not house cats." The tall woman seemed dissatisfied with this answer, but unsure what to do about it. Her composure was further rattled when more women came in behind. They walked straight through and announced their intention to pick out rooms, then climbed the dark wooden staircase. In their wake, a short, faded woman with white hair stood on the doorstep, clutching an old valise. She was attired in well-cut, well-worn, lightweight tweed. The short old woman and the tall dark woman stood in diffident silence for too long, as the rustling and clinks from the next room escalated. There were shouts and banging noises from upstairs. "Junie!" Her head craned round the banisters and met two patient stares. It retreated. Distantly, the sound of a window opening was followed by a frank exchange of opinions about the merits of having to sleep two to a bedroom. "Well, don't stand on the threshold," June commanded, adroitly stepping back inside. "The owners aren't home. Our invitation is a warrant from the War Office." She dropped her voice to a pompous tenor. "I hold in my hand a piece of paper," she declaimed, and brandished the example like a torch held aloft. Come along, Lorraine. Stop fussing with the things and get us a brew on, quickly and quietly. The blonde nodded and explored onward, announcing that she had found the kitchen. June took off her hat and reflexively smoothed her hair. Then she turned and addressed the older woman more softly. "Come along, Alice. Let's find you a room to your liking. I can bunk in with Agnes," she said, indicating the taller individual. Agnes was still standing in silence, but eyeing the whole umbrella stand with intense suspicion, as if it might be about to ask for the loan of a shilling. Then she too took off her hat and hung both on the hooks provided. People moved back and forth. There was shouting and more boxes and crates shoved around. A faint, sweet smell of wood smoke filled the air, and windows throughout were thrown open, providing a cool breeze to chase out the dust. In due course, dusk fell, and the windows were closed. A kettle whistled, tea was made in a battered metal urn, and with some fussing to ensure no marks were left on the furniture, an assembly of sorts was held. There was a companionable solemnity to the rationing out of the tea, and the dolloping of condensed milk from a solid little tin. "Must we have condensed milk?" asked Alice earnestly. "I'll see what I can do tomorrow. Speak to a farmer or something. There must be somewhere local to get milk." "And eggs, Lorraine," insisted the brunette. "Business first," said June, with the brusqueness of rank. "Agnes, did you confirm security? Sentries posted?" Agnes nodded confidently. "And the blackouts are up?" June continued, to receive another nod. "Very well, then. I suppose it's time to tell you about the job we're here to do." Station X, Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. 1 month earlier. "As you were, Chief Bates," barked Squadron Leader Jenkins. "Sir, if this is about the paper requisitions," June objected, but was arrested by a hard look as Jenkins parked behind his desk. A movement intended to convey mastery, somewhat undercut by the cheap wartime flimsiness of the furniture. Agnes, as leading Wren, stayed sitting with her eyes fixed ahead, as if on parade. She said nothing. Lots of the girls are using pencils, and the cheap paper introduces errors due to rips and tears. I didn't think it was worth your time to put it across your desk, protested June. Her words met a curled ginger mustache and quietly faded away. "You think you're very clever, don't you, Bates?" Jenkins sneered. "I think we're all very clever here, sir. My team also works hard," responded June smoothly. "Yes, well." Jenkins hemmed into his tie and adjusted his seat. "It seems your high opinion of yourself is shared by someone at the Special Operations Executive. SOE liked your suggested approach to the latest revision of JN25. "Thank you, sir." "It didn't work, Bates. Your supposition about the number groups was completely mistaken," Jenkins insisted fiercely. "Washington broke it." "Sir." "Nevertheless," the officer continued, almost reluctantly, "it's generated some interest in your contributions here, you and the Wrens in your section." "Civilians too, sir," Agnes interjected, then shut her mouth with a snap in response to Jenkins's glare. "Questions are being asked, as I say. Queries about the wisdom of restricting you ladies to supporting roles. Sir, I've never objected to War Office policy. Not in writing you haven't, Bates. But we both know you're ambitious. I just want my section to have an opportunity to show what it can do, sir. I'm sitting on 2 professors from Oxfordshire, and the other girls have caught on marvelously. We can do a lot more than transcription or abacus shuffling." Mused Jenkins and stared at his desk. "That's why I've come to a decision," he said with finality, and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile, but it was unclear if that was a misfire in his meaning or his ancestry. "I've gone out on a limb, and I've secured you your own analytical cell." Both women looked surprised at this, and exchanged a look. "You'll be given complete authority to organize your command however you choose, and pursue whatever technical approach you like. You'll even have your own billet, the whole shooting match," Jenkins expanded munificently. "You'll remain in our chain of command, of course, for now," he stipulated, and June leaned back in her own chair. "But you're being moved above top secret. Not a word from you to anyone, even within this station. You'll not change your duties on the books here. Officially, you're being moved to archives." "If we're to be a separate section, sir, what will be the subject? Germany, Italy, Japan, even the Reds, they're all covered." Jenkins scowled with exaggerated offense. "Aren't you going to thank me? I'm putting my own reputation on the line for you." "I'm very grateful, sir. Just eager to get started." "Well," the man's face righted itself with an effort. "Good show, yes." Jenkins took to his feet, extracted his pipe, and began pacing. "What do you know about Silent Strutter?" "Is that an agent?" queried June. "It's the code name from the original intercepts. I'll see you have all the files, of course, but I'll summarize to get you introduced. The earliest recording we have is from 1941. More recordings may exist, but we must assume they were lost during the fall of the Navy's Far Eastern bases, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai." "What frequency, sir?" asked June, leaning forward. "Is it tactical or strategic?" "It's not a radio frequency at all. And there's the rub." Jenkins jabbed with his pipe. Both women looked interested. "The intercepts were made using hydrophones from a number of warships, collecting audio recordings. The recordings were intended for training anti-submarine operators on. We mainly have those taken from the destroyer HMS Glamis Wood and the Free Polish cruiser Drakenfell. Their area of operations was the Philippine Sea. We've recently received more that have finally turned up after the excitement earlier this year, Midway and all that." June seemed about to say something, but thought better of it. "The intercepts aren't of immediate concern, you understand. But after Midway, the feeling is that Tojo has to catch on eventually that their JN series of codes is compromised. If they do, then the question is what they switch to instead. They might add features as Enigma added rotors, but equally, they might revert to something older until the new equipment hits the front line. They might switch to Strutter." Jenkins stopped and considered his pipe bowl irritably. "Whatever this Silent Strutter is, we haven't the faintest idea how it works. It could be experimental, but if the Japs switch to it, then it would give them weeks or even months of privacy that we cannot afford. So I've secured you the job of cracking it in advance. Put one in the eye of the Yanks, eh? You'll draw all the recordings we have, speak to Hut 23, and draw Fessenden sets or what have you. Start as soon as you can, once you relocate to your new facility." The man put on a face of wry sorrow. "The nearest lodgment we could find for you is a little ways away, so be sure to pack everything you need. Little village in Oxfordshire. I had a word with Lord Gonias, and he has made an old vicarage available, lock, stock, and barrel. Full grounds and outbuildings." June gave every indication of calm enthusiasm as she said, "If that's the basics, sir, I'll pick up the rest from the files." "We won't let you down, sir," Agnes enthused. "I'm sure you won't. Dismissed." The two women stood, saluted, and exited the office. Walking away in the bright sunshine, they risked a direct exchange for the first time since the meeting started. "Well," said Agnes with a broad smile, "that's quite encouraging. Your own command." "Agnes," said June quietly but emphatically, "we've been fucked." Taynton, Oxfordshire, August 1942. In the convivial darkness of the living room, Agnes had now assembled a bulky collection of audio equipment. She arranged the large sound-emitting trumpet with a punctilious glance at those seated on the fringes. "You'll have the chance to listen to this using individual sets once we unpack fully, but I wanted to get our first impressions together and see what opinions we have. Lorraine, would you take notes?" "Aye, aye, Chief," snapped the blonde, snagging a brown notebook and pencil. Agnes set the playback mechanism deep in the box going and stood back. A low thrum filled the room. June had to speak up to be heard. "What you hear in the background there is the destroyer's own engines and propeller. You'll get used to it and be able to listen past it, but this is still one of the clearest samples of Strutter that we have. All heads craned forward to listen to the rhythmic pulsing. Then, suddenly, the first notes of Strutter were heard. First an eerie groan, then a plopping sound, ponderous and loud, followed by a pause. After the pause, a sequence of plaintive sounds were heard. "Sounds like an animal in pain," remarked the brunette, Valerie, but she was instantly silenced by looks from her colleagues. The plaintive sounds were joined by more in a kind of chorus. These were overcut by a distinct and consistent rising tone, then blurts of sound, some high, some low, sputtering interspersed with sonorous clicks. The elder woman with white hair began tapping her fingers on her chair in time with the rhythm. There was an awed silence, which June broke. Apparently the sonar operators on Glamis Wood made the recordings as a training aid. They thought it was animals too at first. It is similar to whale song, but the repeated rhythmic pulses are like nothing they'd heard before. "I still think it's just an animal," opined the thin, pale blonde Professor Gina Poole with finality. "It's a wild goose chase." A fleeting, pained look crossed June's face. "Well, we've been told to crack it." She flashed a grim smile. "So I don't care if it's a recording of ducks on the Thames. We're going to crack what they're saying, even if it's just directions to the best pondweed. Is that clear?" I said, "Is that clear?" A motley chorus of assent followed. "We are the first intelligence unit that I know of where women are in charge, top to bottom, working independently. A lot of people will be following how we do. Senior people, perhaps right up to the Prime Minister." Valerie arched an eyebrow with such extravagant disdain that there was soft laughter. "Quite beautiful, isn't it?" remarked Alice wistfully, as the sounds continued. "If you say so," replied Professor Gina Poole in her dry, South African accent, lighting a cigarette. "Sounds like a more complex Morse to me." "Sounds like Lorraine after a bean supper," quipped Valerie. "Or the horn section from that bloody awful jazz band in Bexhill," laughed Lorraine in return. "Do we know how it's being sent?" asked Agnes, leaning forward to ash her cigarette. "No, we don't," replied June. "We haven't captured any unexplained equipment, but presumably it's going out to naval receivers using something like our ASDIC sets." Lorraine scratched a note on her pad. "Who else is working on it?" "To my knowledge, it's just us," June returned. Valerie halted mid-puff and raised both eyebrows. "Just 6 of us to crack a completely new code? When do they want it finished by? 1982? There was an embarrassed silence from the other uniformed women, but Gina and Alice, the civilian academics, made rueful noises of agreement. June drew in a deep breath and let it out slowly before speaking. "It's a tough nut, ladies, and one that I'm sure many expect us to fail at." She paused, then coughed a short, bitter laugh. "In fact, I suspect we're being deliberately set up to fail, precisely because a certain gentleman, who shall remain nameless, thinks we are no better than maids of all work, trusted to clean up after our male colleagues, but not capable of serious breakthroughs. But is that all we're good for? Sorting information, collating for others? We've all contributed to improving the art of code-breaking since we arrived, some in small ways and others," she inclined her head respectfully to the academics, "in larger ways. So, the real question isn't whether we can succeed. We cannot know if we will succeed. The real question is, having been given the chance, are we going to quit before we've tried?" June continued heatedly. "Are we going to give up just because the challenge is difficult? We'd be running out on those above us, and they do exist who believe in our potential. And we'd be turning our backs on our boys out at sea, because if the Japs do switch to this code as of now, we'd be operating deaf and blind. So, I'm not going to say that I stood idle and downcast, with the problem on the table, just there." She pointed accusingly. "Right there, on that table." There was a chorus of private silences. "I suppose," mused Professor Poole to her cigarette eventually, "that an impossible puzzle would have its charms." "Why, I do 6 impossible things before breakfast," said Alice. "We'll crack it, Chief," piped in Lorraine loyally. Valerie glanced at Agnes, then bit her nail and looked over at the fire. Taynton, Oxfordshire, September 1942. U.S. forces had opened the landings at Guadalcanal, news of which filtered back on the BBC. The wireless described progress against tough resistance on land, coupled with a seesaw air and naval campaign. A half a world away, ships and men burned and bled. As English autumn does, the nights drew in as stealthy and cold as a couple's first quarrel. Blackberry bushes bore fruit that were left in parcels with the centuries. Villagers trying to conceal naked curiosity behind a patriotic gesture. Sweet blackberry crumble graced the little mess around the sitting-room fire. So it was that as June Bates pulled in and up the gravel drive in her Morris, the house was deep in shadow, the fading warm sun obscured behind wooded hills to the west. Climbing from her car, she grabbed a box and banged in through the front door. I'm late, she said, addressing the assembled faces peering out of the dining room. Can you forgive me? Her team glanced out of the dining room. They were pinched and concentrated. The walls hung with scraps of paper. 2 slate blackboards leaned drunkenly, weeping pale dust onto the parquet floor. Come in, chirped Lorraine. For some reason Agnes won't start without you. June dumped the clinking box and stood politely in the center of the room, radiating attentive pride. Valerie spoke first. We have identified 4 key mechanical elements to the cipher. Agnes interjected. We are sure now that it's a cipher? We are sure it's a message, Alice corrected irritably. The segments of the sounds repeat, but not the whole thing, Agnes elaborated. Lark songs and other simple animal noises repeat. And we don't think it's whales singing, Valerie continued. Why not? Asked June. For the simple reason that we have several recordings where the whales carry on singing when Strutter is banging on, Valerie exclaimed, gesturing helpfully at an indistinguishable stack of vinyl. If Strutter is a whale, then other whales are talking over him. Bit rude. Strutter's also not as chatty, Lorraine said, round her cigarette. According to a killick we spoke to, whales sing for several minutes, sometimes even hours. Strutter runs for up to 10 minutes, but no more. Here, Professor Gina Poole spoke up. And while it's not conclusive, we do seem to have a swell in activity around the big events in theatre. She waved a hand to silence the nascent objections. Although that might be a selection error, because that's when our hounds are running, and their ears are pricked up. Whales apparently go quiet if there's a big show. They don't like the rumpus, Lorraine said, and inexplicably blushed. Definitely a cipher. Got it. June looked relieved. Good to hear we aren't wasting our time. Message, insisted Alice Clark. Agnes straightened her tunic primly, and indicated several large sheets of plain paper, with pencil and charcoal on them. Mathematical workings speckled the margins. So far we have 4 mechanical elements, the rising and falling tones, the groaning and pops, and the stuff that sounds like language with pops and clicks. You said 4. What's the 4th element? June asked, peering closely at the paperwork. Silence, Alice intoned nomically and grimaced. Silence? Asked June. Took us a while to notice, particularly with some recordings split, but Strutter goes quiet sometimes for a patch. Not long, but it's there, which is quite unlike most military communications, unless, Lorraine continued, the operator is making a change to the encoding, like changing the rotors. The trouble is, remarked Poole with arch emphasis, the bloody sender continues transmitting similar sounds after the break. More than one message, then. Valerie moved up and jabbed a finger at some hand-drawn charts. Unlikely. That rising and falling tone, she said, and emitted a soft wolf whistle. It keeps a continuous rising tone to the exact middle of the messages we've recorded, and a falling tone for the remainder. We think it's a form of error correction. You know if you have missed anything. Think of it like sending a written message on numbered pages. So, we are learning something, June summarized optimistically. We've done our work solidly and conscientiously, said Professor Poole in a slightly tense tone, but we're still missing a vital factor in all communications. June raised a somewhat tired eyebrow to indulge the theatrical statement. Alice ventured an explanation. Peccavi. June simply looked more confused. Bletchley has made enormous strides in mathematical deduction and logical processing, but the most basic element isn't given sufficient credit. I dare say it will take another 50 years before the Ministry even takes it seriously. You are speaking in riddles, Alice. Exactly so, said Alice, and jabbed her walking stick in June's direction. 100 years ago, we received one word, peccavi, as a communication from a commander in the field, Sir Charles Napier advancing across India towards Afghanistan. What are we to think? We can deduce mathematically that it's a single word by the length and recognize it as Latin. In Latin it means, I have done wrong, or I have sinned. So perhaps the message means we should convene a court-martial. No. The old woman thumped the floor with her foot. We must understand the beast that sent it, and the beast to whom it was addressed. Napier was very sure of himself. His entire campaign that he was on had been drawn up by himself from whole cloth. He wanted to liberate the natives, a mission his own superiors were dubious about. So is he, again, acknowledging that he has done something wrong? Not quite. With geographic, she emphasized the term. Context, a map in London. We appreciate that in the midst of shot and shell he has sent us a pun. I have conquered what was called the province of Sandi. Peccavi. I have sinned. I have captured Sandi. Context, it always matters. Haven't you spoken to Hut 7? June objected. Gina raised a hand in mild supplication. We spoke to them all right. We have examples of standard form Japanese naval and diplomatic communications. Nothing seems to fit. Here, Valerie swung in, with an air of exasperation. The problem there is that it probably isn't a diplomatic or naval cipher as is, because Tojo wouldn't bother to send the same signal by two different means, particularly when radio will travel farther. What we have is either a unique subject or some inventor sending the Japanese equivalent of, Watson, come here. We need an anthropologist, not a key puncher, Chief, Valerie said simply. There was a long pause as June considered. Well then, let us retire to the sitting room, have ourselves some tea and rum. June pointed at the clanking box. And lobscouse. Then in the morning I shall away to Oxford's dreaming spires to secure more materials on the culture. Professor Poole looked wary. I had better go with you. The competitive spirit runs deep, and there are people in its orbit who we had best steer clear of. The Griffiths Institute particularly has some very odd ducks. They get tremendously defensive around Orphic inquiries. Oxford the next morning had a leaden charm, sweetened by autumnal fires. The ancient honey-gold stonework muted under a shroud of smoke blackening. Cherubs and gargoyles rendered impish against the sky. Inquiries at the Faculty of Oriental Studies revealed that the professor who Gina Poole wanted was engaged in work at the Pitt Rivers Museum. Both women walked the short distance briskly, encouraged by the chill. Finding the Pitt Rivers collection meant walking to and through the Natural History Museum, which stood in splendid Gothic solemnity, its doors like those of a castle. Entering the main hall, Chief Bates was confronted by and arrested in contemplation of a large dinosaur skeleton. It loomed over her in a predatory stoop. Eustreptospondylus oxoniensis, barked Professor Poole impatiently. Dug up not far from here, more than 150 million years old. Incredible, said June, in a reverentially subdued tone. This feller and all his cousins lived before our ancestors ever let go of the trees. She peered at a glinting claw. He'd give us no more thought than Lorraine does to a tinned ham. Wolf it down. Before wolves, too, corrected Gina. The temptation to linger was interrupted by the sounds of raised voices echoing through the cloisters of the cathedral-like chamber. And, intuiting their source, both women moved in that direction. "It's simply not suitable for this display," shouted a short man. His thinning hair exposed that his whole head was crimson with outrage, like a ripe red berry. His interlocutors appeared weary, yet calm, standing defensively around a sheaf of paperwork, one large and speaking in a forthright tone, the second more diffident, bearded, and wearing a workman's apron over a leather-patched suit. "The head of the faculty has already approved the exhibit," said the taller man. "We have all the explanatory material typed up and ready for use." "Nonsense," raged the first man. "Horse feathers. You propose displaying these artifacts with the Pulani exhibits, but the Yaluakoa are completely culturally distinct. You cannot seriously suggest your theories about them are an obstacle," replied the taller man. "You have not been able to get a single one published." "That," the angry man replied with disdain loftier than his diminutive stature, "is merely a reflection of the journal's focus on popular topics over true scholastic inquiry. The Yaluakoa should more properly constitute a study entirely in their own right, given the paleographic record they evidence compared with the rest of Oceanian island cultures." The short man continued with querulous intensity and gesticulated towards the wooden cases. "Do you see any picture writing or runes in any other sample?" "Wrongo, wrongo," crowed the other. "More than 5,000 miles away," came the incredulous response, with a flick of the fringe. The larger man sighed with exasperation and raised his hands as if in surrender. "Very well, you win. We will remove the Cohen artifacts from the exhibit entirely until we can resolve this to your satisfaction. Ugly bloody things anyway," he finished dismissively, then noticed the two women. "I do beg your pardon, ladies. I did not see you there," he remarked gallantly. "Please don't apologize, Professor," replied June smoothly. "I've been in service with the Navy for several years. I was at Lofoten and Dunkirk. I've heard swearing before," she said with a disarming and slightly ferocious smile. "Also, Robert, we are not ladies. We work for a living," added Professor Poole. "Gina!" the man exclaimed, dropping his aloof tone. He stepped forward to take both the professor's hands tenderly. "Wonderful to see you. What brings you to this forgotten ossuary?" "Oh, this and that. I actually had a question for you, if you can help us." "I see," he said soberly, and stood back. "What's it regarding?" "Don't ask. We won't tell." "Very well." He looked around. "We can go up to the upper gallery. We won't be overheard if we keep our voices down." The other two men were already busily focused on repacking some items into cases and seemed oblivious to the interaction. Robert led the way to a dark staircase. Together, they headed into the shadowed upper portions of the Pitt Rivers collection. The structure took the form of a single large ground floor, surmounted by mezzanine galleries of exhibits overlooking the central well. Colored tile, golden stone, and artfully twisted ironwork gave the place the appropriate air of an enormous burial chamber. On the way, they passed glass cases containing wooden models of ships, clay pipes, sealskin survival gear, leering shrunken heads, and glinting steel killing implements. They settled in a corner under some devilish-looking masks. Gina Poole glanced at June for approval, then began speaking, slowly and carefully. "I can't give you any of the background, but I need to know if what I describe rings any bells or gives you any ideas. And we need you to keep this very strictly to yourself. Don't even tell anyone that we were here." "Righto," Robert said cheerily, then caught June scrutinizing him intently. "I understand secrecy, madam. I was an officer in the infantry," he said with affronted dignity. "In the officer training corps," Gina mocked him gently. "The principle is the same," Robert insisted haughtily. "Please, tell me what you can." Gina spread her hands in an unaccustomed gesture of apology. "What we really need to know as if you're aware of any precedents in Japanese culture for something, or know anyone in Japanese academic circles who could have been working with a peculiar form of language. Peculiar how? Asked Robert with great interest. Imagine a language with three main elements, suggested Gina. A single spoken element, accompanied by a second overlay of a rising and falling tone, and a third of rhythmic noises. Noises? Pops and clicks, explained June, and some words, but not classical Japanese. Robert rubbed his neck, somewhat deflated. No, nothing like that in Japanese. Sounds like something from Africa, he said, and jabbed a finger towards some of the artifacts nearby. Well, said June, then can you give us the names of any Japanese academics who might be interested in anything out of the ordinary? Linguists or anthropologists, Gina continued. Haven't had much interaction with Japan in the last few years. Political tensions, what? Not my sort of thing in any case. I'm more your man for slow and steady cross-referencing. He trailed off thoughtfully. There was a gloomy pause. Then the sounds of vituperation drifted up from the floor far below. There was a scraping noise as of heavy furniture being manhandled unkindly across tile, followed by further remonstrance. You know who might be able to help you? Oh, no. I know what you must be thinking, said Robert with a pleading tone. A cranter? But the man's a crank, Gina objected. True, although even I must admit he's the very man for obscure, strange stuff. Bit of a red, though, Robert admitted with distaste. So don't let on anything about the war effort. I'm not entirely sure who he wants to win. How do we get him talking if we can't mention the subject? Oh, that's easy, said Robert, smiling from ear to ear, and raised his voice to just below a shout, and held aloft his arm as if reciting Hamlet. I can't believe you'd waste my time with such trivialities. You can't simply waltz in here and demand information that any undergraduate could look up in the stacks. The noises from below had stopped. Robert winked at Gina, who looked confused, but June was catching on fast. Well, if that's how you feel about it, you old fossil, I'm sorry I bothered. You wouldn't understand a truly novel idea if it bit you on the arse. Robert grimaced, but gave her a nudge with his elbow. Offer to take him to the pub. Good luck. The women made silent gestures of thanks and descended the way they came. They were greeted by the first man, Dr. Acranter, his glasses flashing with comradely venom. I must apologize on behalf of Bob. He's a terrible stuffed shirt. Was there something I could help you with? It's Dr. Marek Acranter, isn't it? Confirmed Gina. I'm Professor Gina Poole, Stellenbosch University. I know Robert from my time here, and I agree he is a positive dumpling. June stepped forward and offered a firm shake. June Bates. I don't know what any of this academic stuff is. I'm just here for the ride. Although, she added quickly before the man could reply, I'm fascinated by the displays. I've not had an opportunity to visit before. Acranter nodded vigorously. I do encourage everyone to visit the collection, even if it was founded by an imperialist. It contains the remains of cultures, many of which are already melting away, burned in the furnaces of industrial capitalism. June smiled sweetly. Did I hear earlier that you have some exhibits here? Acranter looked sour. Not for the moment. I am still synthesizing a hypothesis on a specific set of artifacts. The man began to inflate and straighten as he warmed to his theme. I personally collected them here from a range of sources, but the faculty refused to treat them with the seriousness that they deserve. Intriguing, said Gina, with a touch of overblown theatricality. Acranter, by way of response, turned and led them over to some opened cases stuffed with wood shavings. Then, with the air of a boy showing off cigarette cards, he pulled some items out for their examination. The first, they observed, was a carving in basalt, a frog-like shape, so expertly worked that the hard stone gave an air of plump softness, although the avuncular body was utterly ruined by a head bearing ferocious carved teeth. The teeth had been meticulously represented in 3 rows like those of a shark. It also had the flattened head and soup dish eyes of a fish. "Extraordinary," said Gina, with more genuine feeling. Acranta grinned and burrowed further into the packing. "Household god of some kind?" Gina said, holding the carving up in the dim light. "I perceive a smooth patch on its shoulder. They touched it regularly for luck?" "Uh-huh. Here for comparison," the man said, and handed out another. June squinted intelligently at the second item. "I don't see the connection. This is a sort of toy soldier, isn't it? Or a chess piece? Is that a spear?" "Ah, well," said Acranta, swelling further. "On its own, perhaps, but place them side by side." And he did so, showing their comparable size and material. A smooth patch on the left shoulder was visible on both. The first was found on the island, among a number of smashed-up comparisons. I have the bits over there. This second turned up in a local antiquarian society in New England, now on long-term loan. Look at the incisions, though. The tool marks on the base aren't as well polished. See? Almost identical. "These marks, bronze or iron, surely," ventured Gina. Acranta shoved her playfully, despite her having the idol held aloft in the dim light. "Only had it for a minute and you're already ahead of Robert," he crowed, then became more solemn. "I can't be certain of the tool marks. The cleanness implies modern workmanship, but the provenance is established beyond doubt to 1843 at the latest, which sets it well before traders would be handing out expensive carbon steel. I have no idea how they did it," he reluctantly admitted. "What techniques do they currently use?" "Ah," Acranta deflated slightly. "Well, slight snag there. No one to ask." "Disease?" asked Gina. "Not if their neighbors are to be believed. Wiped them out in a war between the islands." He pouted in frustration. "They seem quite proud of it. Sing songs about it to this day." "Really?" came the somewhat forced expression from June, who then gave in to temptation and drifted away to look at items on her own. "You mentioned some writing?" nudged Gina carefully. "What was their language like?" There was a distant click and a gasp. "Oh," grumbled Marek. "That." A yellow glow shone in the cool dimness like a beacon. "Robert's idea," said Marek, walking over with Gina. "Thinks it should be brightly lit, a sense of the dramatic." They gathered around a clean glass-sided case, exhibited alone in a freestanding booth. Inside, something like a dressmaker's dummy was draped with strands of incredible jewelry. Chains and fine wire joined together flowing curves of ridged and delicately embossed metal. It was further ornamented with discs of green rock and pink coral. "It's all wrong, of course," insisted Acranta smugly. "Anyone can see that these weren't meant to be worn by a modern girl. It's draped every which way and loose. In many cultures, the wealthy are Rubenesque, which would suit far better." Mused June. "Surely you'd have to have a neck like a harness bull to get that anywhere close to a tight fit." "Is it gold? There's a sort of rainbow iridescence to it." "We think so, yes, or at least an alloy, like electrum." "How large was this island that they had a gold and silver mine?" "We don't know for a fact that it is gold or silver," grumbled the man, pensively rubbing his ear. "Those cowards in the material sciences won't get involved until I can get the culture onto the books formally. Higher priorities with the war industries, they said. Pah! Well, it's impressive workmanship, but still, you can't learn a lot about the real culture by studying the kings and queens," Gina added slyly. Acranta turned and nodded so enthusiastically his glasses moved on his nose. "Exactly," he cried. "Which brings us to the writing. Most island cultures have a ceremonial role for the chieftain and nobles, including the island's next-door neighbors, but the Uluakoa seem to have had no wealthy elite. Instead, they seem to have lived with all possessions in common, an advanced communistic arrangement." June and Gina waited patiently for him to continue. The jewelry seems to have been worn mainly by two subgroups, a male priest-king and his followers, and certain of the womenfolk. And you deduce this from the writing? Acranta vacillated. In large part, but I was able to do one better, and began walking away, expecting the women to follow. This is a waste of time, whispered June to Gina. Perhaps we can come back when there's not a war on. Just give it a minute. Once he's got his pet project off his chest and is basking in the afterglow, that's when we will strike, came the quiet reply. He does seem to be a man for out-of-the-way theories and so on. June made a face and scurried to catch up with the retreating professor. He had not stopped his narrative, but had stopped beside a wooden post with 2 headphone sets on it. And that's why I recorded the old man for posterity. Brilliant, blustered Gina. Now, it is imperfect, said Acranta guardedly. I have not yet been able to translate all the fragments of his Cohen speech, but by comparing what he says here with his more lucid talk, I have been able to gather key words and story themes. June politely smoothed her hair and donned one of the headsets. Acranta then set some machinery in motion. Who did you say this was speaking? Asked Gina, picking up an earpiece, but not donning it. A very old man, a sailor out of Callao, Peru. It seems that, as a cabin boy, his ship was involved in the practice of blackbirding in the Pacific Islands, gathering workers for indenture, and they picked up some canoes full of fleeing Cohens during the final war with their neighbors. Most of those taken died in a kind of slavery on land, but one younger fellow stayed aboard, and the man recorded became his friend. They taught each other their languages, and my man took on aspects of the island religion. By the time I spoke to him, his aged mind had become jumbled, and he had lost his eyesight to cataracts. He would talk to me of ghost stories where islanders were visited by their long-dead ancestors wearing the bodies of fish. There would be sacrifices and swimming races, bringing the community together, sometimes in English, sometimes Spanish, and sometimes in Cohen. I think he confused his own identity with that of the enslaved boy, Acranta finished, sadly. Gina nodded politely, then noticed June's expression, which was one of astonished concentration. So she picked up the second headset, listening first with one ear, then quickly with both. June and Gina exchanged a look, then removed the device. Professor Acranta, this is truly remarkable. I've been working on an African dialect that bears superficial similarities to this. She lied smoothly. June gave her a look. I don't suppose you could spare the recordings and transcripts? Acranta considered the request seriously, but with a degree of sour reluctance. He pinched his lower lip. Later, in the car, Gina looked over at June severely. I can't believe you stole the material. Fate wanted us to have those recordings. Kismet, June argued, and continued. Look, we have the legal power to requisition anything we need for our efforts, yes? Bletchley does it all the time. Of course, but we couldn't tell him what it was for. I suppose not. So, continued June, expecting Gina to finish the thought. There followed a long silence, punctuated by the sounds of high-speed escape. I'm going to miss the war when it's over, aren't I? Said Gina Poole wistfully. Taynton, Oxfordshire, October 1942. Japanese attacks on Henderson Airfield continued, in sweltering heat and inky night. The U.S. Marines refused to quit the position, and the artillery thundered for hours over cries of "Banzai" and the roar of aircraft battling overhead. Meanwhile, Mrs. Espalier of the Women's Christian Relief Group paused on the road outside the vicarage, listening. From her vantage point, Mrs. Espalier could hear very faint sounds of rhythmic banging and anguished cries. These were accompanied by whip cracks and gastric blurts. The sound seemed to be coming from an outbuilding on the grounds. Her face reddened, and she hurried away, carrying her curious little dog. "And this helps, does it?" asked June over the din. Alice nodded vigorously, but Valerie turned off first one machine, then the other. Speeding up the playback helps us scan more quickly for patterns. The patterns are still there, only faster, explained the old woman. You must admit listening to the droning for hours does get a bit tiresome. I like to listen to both the old man recordings and Strutter simultaneously, which I can't do with a headset, explained Alice helpfully. I see, said June disapprovingly. And the dancing? Oh, we just do that to keep time, said Valerie simply. Well, it sounds as if you're interfering with an ox, and he is not enjoying it. We can hear you in the main house, so keep it down, ordered June, and left, closing the blanketed door behind her and walking back across the croquet lawn. Wait, Chief, come back, shouted Valerie after her. We didn't tell you what we have found out. And June returned to discover Alice resetting the two recordings. The first thing we noticed is that the similarity between Strutter and the old man's language is even more pronounced with Strutter at higher speed. Interesting, conceded June. I'd imagine that a military signal would want to be sent quickly, and that an old man would speak slowly. What was your second discovery? The second thing we noticed, continued Alice, is that at higher speed, the rising and falling tone is not a smooth gradient. It shifts very slightly within each stretch, but there are distinct moments where the tone jumps. It seems to correspond to gaps in the third element, the pops and clicks. And the number of tonal shifts changes between messages. They start out roughly the same, but the number of actual jumps tends to be high for long transmissions and low for short transmissions. And, Alice continued, we found that the highest pitch varies. Sometimes it peaks lower. What is more, when it is higher, those tend to be the louder messages. We did suspect the shifting background tone had to be useful for something, said June, less strictly. Good work. Keep your chins up, and the volume down, though. Anything new from our specialist? Asked Valerie. Our mystery man from the post office? He struggled with both the problems we gave him, said June ruefully. He hasn't come up with a way of electronically analyzing the wire, although he swears he can if given time. And the other GPO engineers have been unable to come up with any sort of Robinson that will make our sounds underwater. I looked at what they have done, and it appeared to be the result of a high-speed collision between an orchestra and a gasworks, easily several yards across, just to make a noise in a fish tank, let alone what we're hearing over what must be at least a few nautical miles. Nevertheless, June slapped her thigh and straightened her uniform jacket. Good work. Keep plugging away. Returning to the house, June stepped in at the French windows, cross-hatched with blast tape, and found the three other analysts deep in discussion, fussing over an array of symbols and numbers affixed to wooden canes that had left the kitchen garden denuded of runner beans. A selection of picture hooks held some of the more complete ones on the wall. Pieces of paper tape were wrapped around each one, forming sequences of letters and symbols. Professor Gina Poole stood away at the far side of the room, glaring with hate-filled intensity at the puzzles on the wall. Orgiastic, rising screech, Vertagen, read June carefully, and sarcastically, good to see it's coming along. It is actually, remarked Lorraine with aggrieved dignity. We are confident that is what that bit says. We just don't know why. How can we be sure? Asked June, leaning over the work table. It's a phrase that is repeated by Strutter and also by Dreamer. Dreamer? Asked June. Our nickname for the old man on the new recordings, explained Agnes, because he uses Vertagen a lot, and we think it means a kind of sleep or sleepwalking. Dreamer talks a lot about being caught in Vertagen, between life and death, dead and alive at the same time. It's the first phrase we picked up on, because it's the most like normal speech in both cases, although it was only Alice and Valerie who spotted it in Strutter. By the way, complained Lorraine, you could have mentioned that Dreamer's interviews included so much screaming. I nearly lost an eardrum. I didn't know, replied June apologetically. What is he screaming about? Lorraine took a long drag on her cigarette. I have absolutely no idea. Dying, possibly, she considered. Or not dying. At least it is better than the laughter. So, what else do we know? Gina Poole unfolded and came across to stand closer, her hands clasped across her body under her arms. We're making progress, of sorts. Several phrases keep cropping up in common. Oh, I see, remarked June, looking up at the architrave moulding where whole fragments had been fixed on paper sheets. Shark, silent swimmer, eternity, many-eyed, the people. Semiosis, Professor Poole commented, then seeing June's expression explained. The words are the same, but the meaning likely changes depending on usage. So, sighed June, even if we translate it, we're back to riddles. Maybe so, answered Gina fiercely, but we've come a good long way, and we've confirmed that Strutter is very probably talking in this obscure language, rather than, say, a substitution cipher. Why would they be doing that? Asked June with some evident surprise. Well, if we hadn't stumbled upon Dreamer as a Rosetta Stone, we would probably have carried on trying to translate the noises into kanji from the Japanese alphabet for the next 10 years. Obfuscation? Obfuscation, combined with transmitting via underwater. But still, why not use a code? We've been giving that some thought, explained Agnes, indicating Lorraine with an elbow. And we think the key is speed. Strutter means to be sent and understood faster than any other communication, possibly live, like talking on a telephone. No need for enciphering or for deciphering. June raised a finger for quiet and considered this. So, Strutter is for eye-boats, she mused. Probably for hunt coordination of wolf packs? Agnes shook her head, in regret more than disagreement. So far as we can tell, the Japs haven't used anything like that yet, although they might be working on it here. June sighed hugely in relief, then smiled around the room. I know it's not broken, but that's something I can take to HQ and buy us some more time. It's something to get the Navy's teeth into at least, and show our time hasn't been wasted. Hunting wolf packs, very toothsome. Agnes hesitated, then added, I think you are right, of course, but there's no reason this couldn't be used for strategic communication and planning operations if needed. The only problem would be distances, but you could solve that by having repeaters. June smiled again and squeezed Agnes's arm. A very good thought. I'll put that in my report too. There was a pause for general relief, while June drummed out a rhythm with a pencil. What do you need next? She asked finally. Well, what we really need are detailed locations for the intercepts, and a full detail of what was going on, the whole bunch of bananas. If we're going to work on our semiosis, then we will have to put the transmissions into that local picture, finished Gina. And more rum, cried Lorraine seriously. June laughed, thumped the desk in small triumph, and exited the way she came in. Taynton, Oxfordshire, November 1942. In the raging conflict off Guadalcanal, the Japanese battleship Hiei was sent to shell U.S. Marines on land. She ran into U.S. Navy cruisers and destroyers. The far smaller Allied ships engage her at point-blank range, showing enormous courage. Hiei is hit and holed, takes on water, and is eventually scuttled. 188 of her crew are lost with her. Blood and oil stain the water. Lorraine stared moodily at the fish in the tank in the sitting room. I don't think they are well, she said, but received not even a grunt from Alice, who was painting with oils by the fire. Lorraine went over to examine the work from behind. I thought this was going to be a seascape. Alice responded quietly. It started out that way, but I found I wanted to draw what was under the water more. What is it, anyway? I don't know, answered Alice dreamily. I started painting, and this is what came out. To the surprise of the other two women in the room, Alice threw the canvas she was working on directly into the fire with sudden disgust. The colors are all wrong. They didn't have any of the ones I needed, all blues and blacks. It needs to... She searched for the words. It needs iridescence, like the wings of a fly, like the aurora borealis. Her energy was intense and at odds with the listless reaction. Lorraine flopped down in another chair and stared into the lowering fire. It's too hot in here. Too hot and too dry. She tugged at the collar of her uniform. Agnes stared at her. You could go out for a walk. It's too windy. Alice leaned back in her chair, her eyes shut, and gently made a stirring motion with her hands. Her aged fingers drifted like fronds in some unseen current. You should go for a swim. There was a rising tone of argument from the next room. No one reacted for a few seconds. Then Agnes got awkwardly to her feet and went across the hall to see the cause. We have a system, shouted Valerie at Professor Poole. All communications are marked in relation to surface fleet actions recorded in the Admiralty records, and the string tags are the index numbers. I wanted to see if there was another way to look at them, shouted back the professor, equally angrily. You've messed up the system now. It will take me hours to get it straight, came the rejoinder. You haven't achieved anything except making more work. I'm close. You haven't a clue, accused Valerie, then caught sight of Agnes and braced up a little in contrition, closing her mouth tight. But the more senior Wren just looked at them disinterestedly. I was thinking of making some tea. I'm sick of tea, grumbled Gina. I want coffee. There isn't any coffee, said Agnes simply. I know, Gina barked irritably, and lit another cigarette. Agnes left. Gina went back to some scratch paper she was writing and drawing on, while Valerie, with icy fury, began tearing down bundles of the sticks from their irregular arrangement. Agnes found June, her head on her arms, at the kitchen table, and at the sight of her friend in need, Agnes's detached manner softened. She went to place a badly knitted shawl from a chair back over the senior warrant's shoulders, but only succeeded in waking her. You dozed off. Do you want some tea? Are we out of coffee? Afraid so, unless you want me to go on the black market. No, June yawned. We can't sink to that level. Trouble sleeping? It's Alice. She's wandering at all hours, pacing round the house. The countryside's too bloody quiet, and every time she makes a floorboard squeak, I bolt upright. Do you want me to say something? Agnes asked, filling the kettle and placing it on the stove. No, we're all feeling it. June stood, stretched, and ran some cold water over her neck. It's been that kind of month. Agnes just nodded in mute deference. You sleeping all right? Oh, you know, Dunkirk, some of the faces, Agnes said, and the women shared a look. Then Agnes seemed to consider this and found a certain internal sticking place. We'll get there. Will we? Said June, leading to an agonized silence lasting several minutes. This silence was only broken when Gina Poole entered the room. Agnes, look, I'm sorry about snapping. I'm just tired, and there's really no excuse, but... She trailed off slightly. I'm sorry. The kettle piped, making the tension less obvious. Agnes stood and went mechanically through the steps of brewing the large teapot. She set it down on the table with a towel to cover it. Gina sat and fiddled with a ring on her finger. After a further interval, she emitted some sentences in a foreign language, making pops and clicks with her mouth. Give it a rest, said June irritably. That wasn't Dreamer. That was Kosa. It is the Lord's Prayer. What day is it? Sunday? Asked Agnes. Sunday, said June. We've missed church. The village will be saying we're women of loose morals and up to no good. I know I am, joked Gina, provoking faint smiles. Damn it all, Chief, Gina continued softly. We've tried everything. Listen to those recordings until I'm hearing them between breaths. We've got a good grip on Dreamer, and Lorraine is making headway using some of the written hieroglyphs. But when all's said and done, we're no closer to Strutter than we were 3 weeks ago. What are we missing? June seemed to be considering her answer wearily, When back in the study rooms, a scream of alarm issued forth. It was followed by a crash. Bundling into the room, the women found Valerie staring wild-eyed in alarm at Professor Alice Clark. The old woman was chanting a sing-song of groans and clicks and clutching a bundle of message rods with whitened knuckles. "She's bats!" shouted Valerie. "She's totally delally. Came in, asked if we had any salt water, then went rigid, staring into space." "Ulu binuk, ala tua, shushinat, skatet, kolos, waganales, het shem," Alice intoned and rotated slowly towards the arrivals. Her face was screwed up in an expression of intense rage and contempt. "Alice," said June, stepping cautiously forward and extending a steadying arm. "We're here. We're listening. We need you to sit down. You gave us a bit of a shock." Great was the turmoil when a score of mountains shook the waves. "Munificent the bounty," she continued, like an Old Testament prophet, and thrust the bundle of message sticks into the chief Wren's hands. "June 9th, 80 nautical miles west of Midway." "Not with you, old girl," smiled June, jumping slightly as Professor Clark snatched the bundle of message sticks back and began slamming them one by one down on a clear patch of bench, all out of parallel alignment. Hesitating a moment, she strained, snapping two across their length. Lorraine moved to intercede, but June waved her back with a sad shake of her head. Then, finally satisfied, Alice stood back and presented the mess to the onlookers in triumph. There was a long pause. "I'll go and fetch the doctor from Burford," offered Lorraine. With a cry of exasperation and very bad handwriting, Alice Clark launched into another declamatory pose while scribbling on a page of Admiralty reports for them to see. "Poe, Edgar Allan. Elizabeth, it is in vain you say, love not. Thou sayest it in so sweet a way. In vain those words from thee, or Eliel Xanthippes' talents had enforced so well. Ah, if that language from thy heart arise," she finished. Then, seeing the blank looks, she tore the paper into strips and slapped those down. "Eliza. The beginning letter of each line forms her name. It's a God's damned acrostic," she shouted with stupendous rage, and collapsed in a chair. June 7th, Midway. 20 capital ships go into the battle from both sides. June 9th, Strutter sends the message. She waved her stick as if giving a stranger directions to a shop. Mountains, used in fragments C7, D18, and R1 to refer to large ships. Gina was the first to step forward, staring intently and dubiously. Then she reached out and straightened the sticks into a more uniform disorder. "Verdum, my were!" exclaimed Gina in guttural Afrikaans. "She's right. You have to read the grid in several different directions, but the words are there." "Chance, pure chance," the old woman said, closing her eyes. They were lying in a heap there. "I'll get you some water," Lorraine fussed. "With salt in it," shouted Valerie after her, abstractedly. "What do you mean, grid?" asked June. But Alice simply sat, breathing heavily and perspiring. "Each section of code can be cut into strips or lines, as we have," continued Gina. "But Alice is saying that the lines don't come one after another. They go one above the other. Then we read the script in several directions, like a crossword. Same letter counts twice, except in this case it could go in any direction." "Oh my God, Robert!" Gina suddenly exclaimed in realization, with a kind of roar. "The old bluffer was right all along. Wrongo, wrongo." "Excuse me," Lorraine interjected, passing across the water to Alice, who exclaimed in protest and spat a mouthful back out. "He knows fruit salts," Lorraine said plaintively. "Isn't that what you meant?" "Can you explain? Rongo, rongo?" Agnes asked seriously. "Well, the Greeks called a really simple system boustrophodon," explained Gina, beginning to smile. "You have text on several lines, but instead of just reading it in one direction, you rotate the page at the end of the line and read the next line the other way. Except you can make a word puzzle where you rotate it to any orientation. Up, down, at any angle, any permutation. With Rongo Rongo, the language on Easter Island, the suspicion that Robert has is that they also read it in more than one direction. Very little wood to carve on, you see, so they made extra use of what little they did have. Same set of symbols, more than one reading. And you think Strutter is condensing messages by using multiple lines? Alice winced and looked pale. Clearly her outburst had affected her gravely. It's the voices, my dear. Those different pitches and styles. Different lines. Look there in that sample, she finished, and Lorraine fanned her face with an envelope. How on earth did you notice that? Asked Valerie. I hear them in the night, repeating, singing, Alice explained faintly. June looked up from the message. Valerie and Lorraine, take her to the sitting room and put her on the chaise there. Open a window, but stoke the fire up and get her some water without salt in it. No brandy. Strict bed rest. Then Lorraine can fetch a doctor while Val cleans up any scribbles that are in there. This is still a secret establishment. You go on, Alice, and not a word of argument, or I'll have you declared a Robinson and locked up in a safe. After the elderly professor was shown away, June turned back to Alice and Agnes, who were experimentally trying out other arrangements using different messages. Has she gone mad? Or might there be something in it? It's still too soon to tell, but yes, the principle is sound. At least it looks like you can arrange the messages that way. We will have to start over-classifying and transcribing them to account for the different tones, said Agnes ruefully, chewing her lip. But there's nothing actually stopping us doing that. I wonder if the other message elements are instructions in some way. 7 across, 7 down sort of thing? We'd also need to know how big the squares should be. It's fine on a carved stone, but ours could be any size at all. If it were me, I wouldn't make them the same size every time. It reminds me of something, muttered Gina, tapping her teeth with a pencil. Something I read at Gloriana College. At Oxford, undergraduate with Robert. She mused. Oh, well, it should come back to me. The doctor came and went. Alice was given a sedative of Veronal and left on the sofa where she could be supervised. But the other women stayed awake, seized with a new energy that stretched their endurance. When exhausted, they would sit and nap with the old professor by the fire. In spite of the breakthrough they had achieved, the next 2 weeks passed in scratchy intensity, long hours of checking and cross-checking permutations, re-listening and re-inscribing the recordings. June tried and failed to get more personnel resources assigned. The Wrens were led by Alice's almost intuitive grasp on the language and her crossword skills. Word noises were identified in both styles, and by comparing them with the context, words and sounds not in use by Dreamer came to have a narrower sense of possible meaning. We've got a problem, Chief, said Agnes, approaching Chief Bates from behind. The senior Wren stood alone in the night-quiet darkness near the bare apple trees, taking in the heady smell of rotting fruit on the ground. Rather than the obvious quip, June smiled grimly and said instead, Something I can help with? It's the messages, not what we're interpreting. The girls are doing well, but the why of it. What about it? Said June. Seems to be Strutter describing ship engagements mainly. No, June, don't you see that's the point? Agnes insisted. Strutter is exposing themselves to describe military events that Tokyo would already know about via JN25. What's the point of sending a message that Midway started? They'd already know. The Japs are complacent, but literally nobody would want that message 2 days late. And another thing, she continued, pushing her hands down inside her peacoat. Why does Strutter keep giving the number of ships on both sides? The Japs know how many ships they sent, but they also can't know precisely how many the Allies have in the theatre, yet Strutter does. The women looked at each other, while June's cigarette flared in contemplation. So, what does that mean? I don't know, Chief, Agnes admitted, but I wonder if it has anything to do with the rest of the messages. Yes, June agreed, then spoke in quotation. Soft swimming comes the white water, obsidian path, and so forth. I thought her assumption was that it had a military meaning we just didn't understand yet. Another Jap strategic offensive. Australia, maybe. What if it doesn't mean a Jap offensive? Professor Poole said quietly. My God, exclaimed June. You should have been a commando. My father was, said Gina, stepping out of the darkness. He rode with Pete Cronje, and he died in an English concentration camp. I'm sorry, Gina. You never said. June apologized sincerely. It doesn't matter, Gina said dismissively. Her expression stayed as serious as a bayonet. I got to see the book I wanted, and more besides. They let you into the library at Gloriana? Asked Agnes, impressed. I got to see the books, Gina equivocated grimly. I don't understand, June objected. That's good, isn't it? You said that fellow John Dee's alphabet might help us. Gina sighed, and indicating her desire wordlessly, she received a cigarette. Dee's Monus Hieroglyphica did have some useful information. For one thing, his personal symbols share superficial similarities with some of the unknown ones on the stone carvings. Not directly useful, but it suggests that they are representations of stars and planets, which may turn out to mean ours are navigational positions and times, assuming we can find their noise equivalents. That's brilliant, Agnes exclaimed. We can confirm by the position of the intercepts. Gina held up a hand to arrest the enthusiasm. I also looked at the original of Dee's Enochian Square in his De Heptarchia Mystica. It's the same as our Boustrophedon puzzle theory for Strutter. That's good too, isn't it? Agnes said, and half-heartedly nudged Gina's arm. The cigarette she was holding trembled a little too much from the blow. No, you don't understand. It can't be a coincidence. The size of the squares is the same, although Dee has additional elements around the edges of the square. Might be important. She trailed off, as if just having the realization. June and Agnes waited, accustomed to Gina's mode of reasoning. Then, as expected, she geezered into a new train of thought, shaking ash down her scarf. Dee wasn't just some backroom fraud like Kelly, you know. He was a mathematician, a geographer, and chemist. He used his knowledge to advise the English crown through its most dangerous history, darker even than today. And England didn't just survive, it became stronger. He did that. She took a long drag. And he said he got the knowledge he used by talking to angels, using what are called magic squares, very, very similar to the core of Strutter, less the reading instructions, which came to him from conversations with the angels directly. So whoever made Strutter got the idea from Dee? Asked Agnes seriously. Gina visibly suppressed an outburst of frustration. She half raised a clenched fist, then dropped it against her own thigh. There was a third book, she continued, emphasizing the sequence, that was in Gloriana's college library next to Monus and the Heptarchia. It wasn't listed in the catalogue. It was in a rather flimsy locked box. It's a book that isn't supposed to exist. It's a myth. Gloriana has a copy of Dee's translation of the Necronomicon, which itself is supposed to be some Arab Gnostic work written by a lunatic. The translation is encoded in Dee's own personal shorthand, but I got interested in him as an undergraduate, and I was able to get a lot from the Necronomicon translation before I had to leave. June and Agnes carefully ignored the implicit nature of the access Professor Poole had achieved. How does this necro book help us with Strutter? June asked stolidly. Gina laughed, a cold, short bark. Starlight made her eyes glitter feverishly. The mainstream history of Dee is that he spoke to the angels in visions. However, I read the true instructions in his translation of the Necronomicon. They involve visits to the sea, which Dee passed off as trips to Europe. He had to cast symbols into the water and swim down at specific locations around England's coast. Thanet, Bosom, the Isle of Seacliff. He experimented at many places shunned by their neighbors due to rumors of nameless rites and rituals. Well, not just here. Apparently there are special spots in all the oceans. Dee wasn't really aware of the Pacific, of course, but he knew about the east coast of America. It's why he encouraged Queen Elizabeth to set up colonies in Massachusetts. Gina realized she had digressed and shook her head. Her clipped diction intensified, and her accent deepened. Dee talks about hierarchies of angels in his mainstream writing, of course. He lived in a stratified age of rank, with everything in its place. But what he left out was the things above and behind the angels who spoke to him directly. His marginalia says that he withholds details for fear of human persecution, although I saw in his words rather a reluctance to consider the awful ramifications of what he witnessed. The aspect of the angels he met in the water was bad enough. Needle-mouthed, waddling legions, aping the forms of men, but twisted and hulking, with gigantic, lidless eyes. They declared all things common property, even Dee's wife, as a mark of understanding. Human flesh, eaten or defiled, both equally joyous to them. But Dee found the fish things a mere commonplace horror in comparison to the great ancestors that they worshipped. Beings ancient beyond comprehension, beings who dreamed of death through the age of the dinosaurs. They lie in the deepest parts of the ocean, Dee said. As father and mother, they neglect their own foul offspring except during their ceremonies, when they sing harmonies together. Great paeans which link their lightless cities around the whole world in blasphemous communion. June wearily parked herself on a short step-ladder by the apple tree and folded her arms. "Don't sit there and take this so calmly," Gina fumed. "I know it sounds crazy, but you haven't seen what I've seen. The Necronomicon, even translated." She stretched for an explanation, as if she were peeling back a bandaged head wound. When you look at the text, you don't assess what you're reading. It's like the book is writing into you with handfuls of hot sand, and it all links back to Strutter. Everything. "What are you saying?" asked Agnes. "I know that you were already thinking it, Aggie." Gina had become rigid, as if her words were physically torturing her. She spat out her next statements. "Strutter's not Japanese. You only cling to that assumption because no one at HQ will like the alternative. Strutter's something else. I mean, the structure alone is suggestive. What human could speak live what it takes us hours to write down and follow, to do it in their head? I believe—" "No," said June firmly, standing up. "Gina, I can't order you to calm down, but I'm going to remind you that we have a job to do. I'm sorry your nerves are fraying, but it's just not good enough. You need to get a grip. If angels and fairies help us do that job, then so be it. No doubt Strutter has been inspired by this D fellow, the way the Caesar cipher influenced Enigma, but," she emphasized, with a tone earned the hard way through fire and sea foam, "that's as far as it goes. I want none of this wild supposition going around. You tell the girls about the symbols they need, and you carry on working up the decrypt algorithm. You will not say a single solitary word about underwater bogeymen, not to my girls, and certainly not to Station X. I've got one of my best people laid up sick. I've got the full attention of the Admiralty. We have a duty to perform." She broke eye contact with Gina to check on Agnes, who seemed torn, but who had braced up in uniformed obeisance. "Do you understand me, Professor?" Taynton, Oxfordshire, December 1942. HMAS Armadale, a fast corvette, was caught while attempting to evacuate Allied soldiers and civilians from East Timor. She was seen by more than a dozen Japanese aircraft, and eventually hit by bombs and torpedoes. After the order to abandon ship, the aircraft strafed the helpless survivors in the water. In an attempt to throw the attackers off, ordinary seaman Teddy Sheehan went back and strapped himself to one of the guns. He continued firing, defending his shipmates to the last possible second, even as the ship slid under. "Mince pie?" asked Lorraine. "No," replied Valerie, without looking up from her darning. "No, me neither," Lorraine said, and stared out of the window. A red robin bobbed across the lawn, searching for worms in the hard, cold ground. "You're evading the question," Professor Clark muttered irritably. "The answer's the same, old girl," said Valerie, with comradely condescension. "June has said you're not strong enough to go back on duty." "But it's in my mind," the old woman moaned. "I can hear them right now. I might as well be working on it. At least bring me some paper and pencils." The two younger women shared a look. "We're doing perfectly well without you, I'm sad to say," said June, surprising all three as she bustled in. The chief Wren placed the back of one hand on Alice's forehead. "I'm afraid I will have to report that you're surplus to requirements." "Can we turn her into glue?" joked Lorraine, provoking a weak shriek of outrage from the professor. "You're all monsters," Alice responded, somewhat feebly, but in good humor. A shadow passed over June's face, and she took Alice's pulse by way of distraction. "Cut along, girls. I'll take over here for a bit." And Valerie and Lorraine returned to the analytical room. Alice accepted a sip of plain water with ill grace. "At least catch me up on where we are." June looked stolid in denial, and Alice fixed her with a one-eyed glare of menace. "Fill me in, or I shall begin singing Christmas carols from my youth, and I warn you that I don't remember the words or the tunes." June's tired face broke reluctantly into a true smile. Alice patted her hand and lay down, exhausted on her pillow. Back in the analytical room, the atmosphere was thick with cigarette smoke, to the point that the cat's cradle of string and rods was almost totally obscured. But it was the focus of such attention that no one thought to open a window. "That's what I'm saying," repeated Agnes. "But I thought we had already cracked the decrypt with the across thing," Lorraine objected. "I think what Aggie's saying is that the key is the unrelated words," Valerie said, circling the strange collection of twine and message sticks. "This is the best we could do without using mathematics, which apparently they no longer teach in schools." Gina jumped to her feet and waved her arms. "Look, it's like Alice said about Peccavi. Except imagine you don't want to rely on knowing it's a pun. How do you do that?" "Say it's a pun," Lorraine pouted. "Well, what Strutter is doing is describing the context around the message by literally including the context around each statement with the message. So," she picked up a thread in the structure, with a gift label tied to each end in a strange multidimensional spider web. She shook it gravely, but only provoked further visible confusion. "Why would Strutter need to do that? The receiver knows what Strutter has said before, surely," Valerie said defiantly. Agnes and Gina shared a serious look, and Gina glanced away. "It's not just pointing to history," Agnes explained. "In this fragment, GJ43, Strutter talks about a mountain, right? The mountain is moving between the navigational points, denoted by the pops and clicks." "Right. And the main message read doesn't take into account these other word phrases all tangled up close to mountain in the grid. Seagull, sunset, bloodletting. We've been treating these close-by words as junk because the opening doesn't tell us to read them. So, if we just take the message fragment as read, it doesn't say very much. But allow the words in the main message to carry meaning over from words and phrases nearby." Gina picked up the baton. "What does it make you think of?" "This doesn't sound very reliable," Valerie objected. Lorraine seemed more willing to hazard a guess and pointed at some of the colored string. "Does each of those words carry the meaning context from the words near them, walking hand in hand, so to speak?" Gina nodded feverishly. "Seagull, sunset, bloodletting. Seagull to tooth and dive, sunset to mountain and home, bloodletting to waken and the rest," she mused. "It's like determinatives in hieroglyphics," Gina prompted with a fatalistic air. "Silent symbols that clarify meaning." However, neither of the two younger Wrens were helped by this. Lorraine continued, waving a pencil like a wand. Seagull meaning here an aeroplane, a plane returning home, tooth and dive, a dive bomber, bloodletting central, a fight. And if we check the action reports, exactly so. It's brilliant, enthused Lorraine. It's a mess, complained Valerie. And it's even less secure if Strutter actually explains the meaning of what we thought were code words. I mean, what the hell is Tokyo thinking? It would be more sensible to leave the code words as code words. Agnes nearly held up a hand as if in class, with out-of-character overexcitement. It makes sense, though, if this is a method for getting individual I-boats to cooperate without preamble. Submarines working alone, coming together for an attack, reduces confusion. Gina opened her mouth and shut it again, unnoticed. In the ensuing days, the old vicarage resounded with puffing and swearing, both good and bad, as the archive of messages was checked and rechecked. Everyone grew more tired, but the allure of completing the task drew them on, like a cresting wave racing to shore. "I still don't like it," said Valerie. Lorraine looked up at her with fatigue-rimmed eyes. "We don't have to like it. For now, we just have to confirm that this is how it works," Agnes said simply, and gave a hollow laugh. "Do you remember intercept analysis last year?" Valerie twisted her face into a mask of rueful agreement, checking endless possibilities for key ciphers, hour after hour after hour. She stretched out cramp in one leg. "Okay, this is better than that. It's just not very scientific," she continued. "How do you mean?" Lorraine asked innocently. "Well, it's all still very open to interpretation. That's why June has us doubling up, though. 2 separate teams to each message." "Yes, but don't you think it's more poetry than good breaking?" "What do you think we should do?" asked Lorraine, with a conciliatory tone. "I was talking to Prof. Poole earlier," Valerie said, with a hint of reservation. "She's pushing herself too hard," Lorraine objected. "No harder than the rest of us. Anyway, she was saying it's all about getting inside Strutter's head, but—" And here Valerie began chewing ferociously on a pencil stub, like an American gangster with a cigar. "I think it would be more reliable if we stuck to frequency analysis than whatever this is, mesmerism." "It is a bit like that," Valerie conceded. "Like peering inside Strutter's head, knowing what they think about when they say something." Valerie got up and went over to a board covered in tally marks. "Excluding the clicks and pops that represent star systems, the frequency analysis we did on the remaining common junk text is—" She peered in closely. "Waking goes up over time. Death dreaming goes down over time. Heart stays steady. Cthulhu Galan. Still don't know what that means." Lorraine moved in next to her. "The only thing I'll say is that it might explain why so much of the message is repeated each time. In a substitution cipher of some kind, that would be crazy. It would be handing out cribs. 'Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have ransomed me, O Lord, God of truth. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eye is wasted away from grief, my soul and my body also. Lord, Lord, Lord.'" The pair turned to stare at Professor Poole, who had come into the room and was closing an old leather-bound pocketbook of psalms. She downcast her eyes in reflection, but when she raised them again, they were dark and full of fire. "Says a lot, doesn't it? Like Jerry repeating, 'Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler.'" Both Valerie and Lorraine were taken aback by the passionate and inscrutable outburst. "Strutter is telling us that something is waking up," Gina said, stalking forward to point at the board. "And it's the most important thing that Strutter wants to talk about, central to everything." "I was thinking about what you said, and you're right, of course. We need to put frequency analysis in. Back in," Gina conceded, and tapped Valerie with the book in awkward acknowledgement. The younger woman frowned slightly. "What is waking up?" she asked. Lorraine frowned and glanced down at her notes in her hand. "Mother Hydra, I suppose, whatever that is." Gina deflated into a chair. It's clear what it is. It just doesn't have a military translation. Dreamer talks about Mother Hydra, and we know from the position data that Cthulhu Galan is a place where it is happening. So, what do you think it is? Lorraine pressed innocently. Gina twisted in her chair, as if her legs were overlong heirlooms left to her by an unhelpful aunt. She avoided eye contact by staring out of the dark windows. I'm not certain. Valerie leaned back against the table and smoothed her skirt with her free hand. I don't know what is going on with you, June and Agnes, but I can't take it. Just cough it out. Lorraine made an encouraging face. Gina twisted again, and when she spoke it burst out like a sneeze. Mother Hydra is a god. She catapulted restlessly to her feet and marched over to some of the message sticks, which were resting in the umbrella stand used for checked items. Dreamer mentions Mother Hydra several times in his third recording. Lorraine grimaced in distaste. That's the worst one, laughing and screaming all together. Gina continued, setting up some of the material in an armature made of coat hangers. She gestured as she spoke, but without her usual enthusiasm. Dreamer talks about the island gods, strange, distant things, of which the two main ones are Father Dagon and Mother Hydra. The fish ancestors brought gold and food to the people, but even the ancestors are frightened of their gods. Mother Hydra gave birth to the people, but they always warned that one day she would come and eat the world. I think their human sacrifices were supposed to be mainly about stopping that happening. You haven't mentioned this to Alice, have you? Lorraine asked crossly. She's been talking about trying to swim away from something coming, and last night she'd been crying. I had to, Gina said reflectively, and ignoring Lorraine's expression of stern disapproval. It's like she can hear the meaning between the words, something deep in her. It calls to her in a way mathematics and reason cannot capture. But where does it get us? Valerie interjected, likewise ignoring Lorraine's compassionate outrage. The key isn't Mother Hydra. It's why I wanted to talk to you while June and Agnes are up at Bletchley. The junk text clearly says that Mother Hydra is waking up. I need to know why. Why is she waking up? If we know why, maybe we can stop it. Valerie threw up her hands in an abbreviated gesture of surrender. I'm not saying I buy this unhinged theory, but sure, let's satisfy that question at least. It might be useful. Lorraine snorted in disgust. I'm having nothing to do with this. You didn't ought to torment an old woman with these theories. She's not well. And so saying, she stormed out to check on Alice. Valerie and Gina spent 4 hours piecing together information from punch sheets and filing cards. Okay, I concede Cthulhu Galan is probably an area of very deep water, when the coordinates aren't apparently out between the stars. But I can't explain why it seems to shift location between so many different positions. Gina stared coldly at a fixed point ahead. Maybe the position actually does change. You mean wherever Mother Hydra is, that's Cthulhu Galan? Valerie mused and scratched her ear. Sleepwalk, does she? I'm going to just put down that it is a great trench in the seafloor. There was a long pause. Valerie broke the silence. So Mother Hydra must be some kind of deep-diving submarine. Maybe that's why they have to use sound instead of radio that won't travel underwater. A resupply craft, maybe. Gina seemed lost in awful cogitation. Could be a troop carrier, or an invasion fleet of them, Valerie said more enthusiastically. Gina shook her head slowly. It's not that. I just realized the why. Valerie was scribbling down notes, capturing her last thought, and underscored Wendy Hinder, then added 2 question marks with a degree of self-doubt. It's been staring us in the face, Gina continued, mostly to herself. She stood and drew a broad, elegant sweep on the blackboard. Then she underlined several key terms. The frequency is linked to ship casualties, and casualties are linked to fleet actions, and the more intense they get, the less vertagen. Her voice rose in a crescendo. Every bomb, every rocket, every boiler explosion and scream echoing down through inky fathoms into that festering abyssal ooze. All that death, all that noise clamoring like an alarm bell. She turned to an incredulous Valerie. The war is waking her up. And then what happens? Valerie asked, with exhausted fatalism. There followed a pause of such length that Valerie closed her eyes for a moment. When she roused, it was because Gina had slammed a piece of paper down in front of her. It was so covered in calculations and spider web connections that it resembled spirit writing. We've been treating the people as if it is one word, one thing, but it co-associates with 3 different sets of determinatives. I don't know what people of low and earth means, as they only come up once, but I think we are people of upper earth. They call our ships mountains. According to what we have, the Mother Hydra's hunger will sing to her people of the waters. Her angels will rise from their temples and try to feed her all the people of upper earth, us, although they don't know if that will satiate her. She may consume her own people too without hesitation. Gina began to weep, but kept talking. Can you imagine what that will be like? It won't be like shoveling coal into a furnace. Dreamer says that they feel emotions as common property too. If we feel fear, they will be sympathetic, except they enjoy it. Our decimation will be a feast for their jaded senses, a bloody carnival in the streets of every city and town in the world. Gina pulled a notebook out, rumpled and scarred with even more frantic writing. Here, look. Dee said that those they do not consume are taken to breed with them, to create little half-things that live alongside them. If any of us are left, humanity will dissipate like drops of blood on an incoming tide. All that we are will be lost to corruption. No more London, or Tokyo, or New York. No one will walk in Notre Dame Cathedral and love its curved buttresses and bright-stained glass. No more dawn birdsong amid dry grass with warm sun on your face. Just endless bleating of mad words to mad gods in undying chorus, unified forever in fish-smelling darkness and degradation. Valerie looked at her and drew back slightly. Whatever these things are, didn't you say that they can die from warfare? You said it happened to some on that island. And if they attack, then they've chosen a bad time to do it. We've never been so ready for war. Gina clenched her hands and ground them together, as if in prayer or pain. If they rise, then their gods will be right behind them, gods that have lived and slept before man existed, before the dinosaurs. The singing ones are terrified by the mere thought of them, and they are of their flesh. What would it be like to face them as a mere human? It would surely wash away all thought and all conviction. Fight them? She laughed shrilly. Are you mad? Valerie patted her colleague on the shoulder, but behind her eyes an empathetic light had gone out. Taynton, Oxfordshire, January 1943. Government censors had begun releasing news of the Allied naval casualties that had been sustained in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands months ago in October. The carrier USS Hornet, 3 battle cruisers and 7 destroyers, all badly damaged or sunk. The news might be fresh to the public. By this time, the hulls of the lost ships were already rusting, cold on the seabed. Valerie rubbed her eyes and took a sip of water. The room was icy and damp, but she stuck to the task. A crust of bread and half-eaten apple sat on the edge of the table nearby. Wind sighed under the door and probed the windows. With great care and precision, the young woman took a steel ruler and marked out a grid on paper using a heavy pencil. Then she transcribed the message from the deciphering sticks into the grid. This was followed by the reading order written into the left margin, using the measured deliberation of the chronically fatigued. Metal storm again shakes the great trench. Mountains sink, upper earth blood singing. Sacrifice, new strange death dreams awaken. The tide is rising. Lower earth, oyster door, night banquet. Divide, manifold, spear heart. Rising sun, ascendant peak. She took the completed message, placed it in an envelope marked top secret, and returned to the desk area. Another swift rub of her eyes, a yawn, and she took up the steel ruler again. The door opened, and June stamped in, trailing evening air and the threat of frost. "Still at it?" "Yes, Chief," answered Valerie doggedly. "Very good. I'll join you to get the transcripts ready to be picked up after I check on Alice." "I think Professor Poole is in there already," Valerie said quietly, more focused on her work. "I'll look in anyway. Where are Lorraine and Agnes?" "She said they were sleepy after dinner." "Oh, was it good?" asked June as a forced nicety. "Looked pretty awful. Gina got it up. I wasn't hungry." June crossed the hall, pausing to notice that the clock had stopped. But she realized she had no idea where the winding key had got to, and carried on into the sitting room. It was barely illuminated by the embers of a fire, and a sharp chemical smell was detectable over the sickbed reek. "Back so soon?" came the voice of Professor Poole. She was sitting in a tall-backed armchair by Alice Clark's sofa. The latter's wrinkled left arm rested pale upon her coverlet. "Did you ask them to stop the fighting?" "No," replied June brusquely. Then she walked purposefully over to the side of the fireplace and began gathering together bits of wood for the fire. She cursed the dim glow of the embers in the grate. "I knew they wouldn't," said Gina, her voice hoarse. "They'll never understand. Not until this stupid war actually does wake the ravening darkness. There might still be time to stop it for all we know. You have to try." June hesitated only slightly. "I didn't tell them that. I told them we have cracked the code and to send an armed guard for the transcripts in the morning. Once we have passed over the material, we'll be given a holiday, as long as we need," June finished with brittle optimism. Gina shook her head, like a toddler fighting their bedtime. "Nowhere to go. No way to get away from the singing ones, not really. They can walk abroad if they like. They only stay underwater to be close to their mother." She released a soft moan of exhaustion and despair. "I've requested you go to a hospital for a bit. You can go with Alice, just until you are well again," June said more tenderly. "We couldn't have done it without you." "Can you believe they mass-produced these?" Gina asked, shifting to reveal what she was holding. It was a dark, oval object. Her thumb stroked it softly, like the back of a lover's hand. "Number 36 Mills bomb. It turns out our guards were issued a box by the ever-thoughtful bureaucracy. Not nearly as heavy as I thought it would be. One feels as if it should be as heavy as a gravestone, at least." June froze in place, then looked harder at Alice Clark's face. It was grey, and her dentulous jaw hung slack and unmoving. "Yes," said Gina, almost wistfully. "Alice can't suffer any more. I gave her a treble dose of the Veronal." She snorted, mirthlessly. "I even took some myself, just to steady the nerves. Agnes and Lorraine will be out too by now. Which reminds me." She glanced around, as if looking for her handbag. Then, with a grunt of satisfaction, she lashed out with her foot. There was an unseen clonk, followed by a slopping, gurgling noise of liquid spilling. "Put the grenade down, Professor," June ordered. "I don't think you understand the ramifications of that statement," Gina said with doleful gentility. "In accordance with the instructions, I have removed the pin. So if I put it down, I must let go of the spoon. The spoon comes off, apparently, the device arms, and seconds later—" Her mind drifted. "Don't you think your Kipling would approve? He wouldn't want to be awake when the singing ones rise from Yarn the Thlay." Better to go to our God like soldiers. We've earned that at least, haven't we?" Gina's eyes caught the light. They were earnestly imploring. "Gina, June pleaded, as she heard a small metallic sound and a clink. Not hesitating, she scrambled for the sitting-room door and threw herself awkwardly through. The noise that followed was too loud to be heard, and made her legs feel strange. Eventually, she realized Valerie was over her, shouting. "Fire!" Valerie yelled. "Fire!" But June was semi-conscious, and could only watch as Valerie tried to enter the furnace that the sitting room had become. Quickly recognizing that it was futile, she began dragging her injured comrade towards the door. It was hard work, taking precious moments, as the blaze spread, accelerated by spilled petrol. Out on the gravel drive, June managed to remember her words. "Must get Lorraine and Agnes. I'm sure that bomb or whatever it was woke them up," Valerie said with fierce bonhomie. "I need to do something about your legs. Can't have you bleeding everywhere." "No," persisted June. "Legs. Gina drugged." Valerie ignored this obvious nonsense and began checking June's injuries in the flickering firelight. "A few burns, a few small holes. I'm more worried about your nylons, old girl. They might be a goner," she quipped. June gripped her arm so hard it made the younger woman yelp. "Get the others out. Now! That is an order." Grumbling, Valerie stood and pulled her jacket over her head. She braved the hall and mounted the stairs. Shouts and coughs could be heard. Distantly, the rest of the village began to rouse itself. Then, horrendously, fire blossomed on the upper floors of the vicarage. The spreading inferno had found a second jerry can. The windows blew into fragments. June's grief and pain became too much, and she passed out. Some hours later, she revived, to discover a bearded doctor moving her into a seated position. "Oh, thank God. We weren't sure if you were going to be all right, dear," said a worried Mrs. Espalier. Her face became suddenly illuminated by the dancing headlights of 2 motor cars that pulled in at the roadside. A number of men in uniform got out. "Dr. Sledge?" asked a fresh-faced captain. "You called this in to the air warden." "That's me, yes. Looks like a stray bomb hit the house. This is the only survivor so far as I know." June moaned again, in despair. "You've done the right thing, Doctor, but we'll take over now," the captain said reassuringly. "Corporal." "Now," he continued, "I need you to go home and write down the particulars. Just the basics. We'll take care of everything from here." "You're sure you don't need help?" twittered Mrs. Espalier. "No, thank you, madam. If this was an incendiary, there may be other devices unexploded hereabouts." He raised his voice so as to be heard by the other onlookers. "Thank you all for your help, but we need to sweep the area with the ARP. Please return to your homes. We will give the all-clear door-to-door when we are finished in the morning." A medical orderly appeared and began dressing the Chief Wren's injuries in a swift and sure fashion. She answered a few brief questions and looked into a flashlight beam to their evident satisfaction. Standing up, they nodded to the occupant of one of the cars, who then got out. The man came over, and after checking the grass, he knelt carefully beside the injured woman. He was immaculately attired, but carried a legacy of scar tissue across his nose, and something had torn away part of his left ear. "Chief Wren, June Bates, we've come to collect the decrypts. Did anything survive the explosion?" "What? No, at least I don't think so." "Ah, too late this time," remarked the newcomer with urbane regret. "Well, these things happen." He turned to a powerfully built sergeant wearing the dark green hackle of the Lancashire Rangers. "I will want a group out here on the double to comb through the ashes, every scrap and fragment collected." He considered. "Arrange for mine detection sets, too. We especially want anything left of the wire recordings." "Sir." The soldier nodded, went to the rear of the vehicle, and proceeded to extract and operate a mobile field radio. "Should have listened to her," June said woozily. The man made a rueful face and began to pat her comfortingly, but thought better of it. "You weren't to know. You had your mission objective and you stuck to it. If we're to win this thing, it will be because of people like you, Chief Bates." "Don't understand," June slurred, trying to focus. "The messages, they're not Japanese Navy. Something worse, living under the sea. Nothing we can do," she finished and closed her eyes. "Rest now," said the man. "We've had our eye on you ever since the break-in at Gloriana, and I believe you." He smiled grimly. "Apart from your suggestion that there is nothing that we can do. It's why I want you to come and continue your work for us, if, that is, you will consent to working for my organization directly. I already have the backing of your officer commanding." "You haven't even said who you are," objected June, wiping a smear of ash across her cheek. "Of course. I represent a branch of the Foreign Intelligence Services. You might say the most foreign," he answered, smiling warmly. Then he gave her his hand in a firm grip. "I am Jasper Courant." If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,